kita ke sini. Kita cari ya. Oke. Lanjutin sebenarnya kemarin juga tadi datang kira sini ya. Mana ya? Mana ya? Lupa boy. Coba deh. Bukan. Wait, skip bukan. Chat bukan. Jadi kedua bukan. Mana sekarang? Desain present. Oh shit, gue lupa beneran bro. Oke, kita source team testimoni tidak double script kan lah lakukan tanpa ngadi-ngadi ya. Sebenarnya kita mau lanjutin yang kemarin kan, yang pelajaran satu udah di screenboard. Nah kemarin kan kita udah belajar HTML nya, sekarang kita belajar CSS. Oke, tapi gimana dulu klik project harusnya sini pakai ini kah? Cuci banget. Di sini kita akan tambahkan file aja ya, screenboard. Oke, di sini kita bikin kita pakai di situ ya. Udah.
Welcome to the second section of this course where you are going to graduate from...
Jelaskan. Mengubah page, bentar dulu. Ini tuh gimana? Save dulu. Oke. Oh ya udah deh.
from HTML into the world of CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, as it stands for. This is super exciting because now you'll be able to make your sites look beautiful as well.
Okay.
So the main project of this section is actually the google.com homepage, because this time around you are going to write the CSS as well. And the
Soalnya kita nggak curang, ingat kita nggak curang, kita cuma kehilangan file aja. Kita disediakan jadwal namanya indeks kita dan oke. Nah, ini kan dasarnya iyalah. Oke, kita di sini adalah link style CSS dan ini adalah Spec juga. Kita cari, kita biar ini aja, biar tahu kalau kita tuh bukan mana kita. Oke, nah kita kan Google PNG-nya nih ya, tetap kita cari dulu Google PNG. Manis. Setelah kita ke open image in new tab, save images, kita ke data GI Scrimba. Google PNG. Kita akan contek dulu ini ya, kan kayak gini. Pertama dari body itu ada, kita langsung div plus main. Itu ada image Google PNG, outnya adalah plusnya logo yang wadaw, cipa maju. Apa? Terima kasih. Kamu dulu aja. Plus logo PNG. Kalau logo image. Source tetap tetap sub image udah input text input plus search input. Plus search input dan text menu. Div plus button for ya button result sama button plus button juga div body attack.
This probably looks a little bit frightening right now, but don't worry, I'm going to take you through it step by step. And actually, before we get going with Google, we're going to get you familiar with the syntax here and have some fun destroying wikipedia.org. So it's going to be a lot of fun and we have no time to lose. Let's just get started. Okay, so let's get you writing your first lines of CSS straight out of the gate. As you can see here, we have an HTML file which has a body that simply has "please accept our cookies" as text directly in the body tag. And that is rendered here in the mini browser. However, as you'll notice, the style doesn't exactly look like default browser styling. And that is because we've added this line here, which says link, meaning it's linking to something. And what kind of relation does this link has to our HTML? Well, it's rel style sheet. It is a sheet that contains styles. And where does this sheet live? Well, that is dictated by the href attribute, which you probably recognize from anchor tags, and it's pointing to styles.css. And lo and behold, in our file system, we have a styles.css file. And there we can see a few lines of scary looking code you've never seen before, perhaps. However, don't worry, we're going to go through this. So what happens here is that this CSS code is being pulled into the HTML file by this line 3 here, and then it is applied to the website when it is rendered. So if we were to comment out this line 3 here and rerun the example, it'll look very boring like this. So let's undo that. Doesn't exactly look great now either, but it's at least some styling. Although this cookie widget is a little bit weirdly designed in my opinion. Which leads me to your challenge. You are going to redesign this cookie widget by changing the values inside of this body selector. And now you might ask, well, what is a selector? Okay, let's go through that, because that is the basic CSS syntax you need to know in order to solve this challenge. So, CSS works by selecting certain elements on the page, that is HTML elements, and then styling them however you want. And the element you select is what you start with when writing a CSS rule. Here, we are selecting the body. That is the exact same thing we're doing here. And what's our body? Well, it is this tag right here. Then, in order to apply some specific styling to the body tag, we write an opening curly bracket and a close curly bracket. And then inside of those brackets, we have something called a property, which in this case is color, and a value, which in this case is red. So here we're saying that the color, which is actually text color, that's what color means here, the text color in the body should be red. So if I now change the color property from blue to red, you can see in the mini browser we have changed the text inside of our body to red, because if we head over to the HTML, this text is indeed inside of our body. Now, as you might have noticed as well, the property is followed by colon and the value is followed by semicolon. And you have to have that notation, otherwise you'll break the example. So what I want you to do now is redesign this cookie widget. Make sure you change all of the listed CSS properties. That's background, color, font size, font weight, text align, and margin top. And what you'll change it to is up to you, but I've given you the hints of what kind of values the properties expect here in the comments on the right hand side. You can see comments in CSS is done with this star and slash character. So the grayed out text, as in with the HTML, is not interpreted by the browser. It's just help text for you in order to solve this challenge. And I'm intentionally not giving you any more information about what each of these properties mean, because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So I want you to experiment with changing them and draw your own conclusions as to what, for example, the font size does to the styling on our page. And then once you've done this, once you've redesigned the cookie widget, move on to the next scrim, and then I will show you how I would do it as well.
Oke, berarti pertama kita bikin redaksi CSS. Oke, indeks yang di copy dulu, terus di paste lagi. Ini juga di copy dulu, terus di paste di sini. Belum apa-apa, anjingnya udah ini, udah cegukan. Iya, kayak cegukan. Oke, di sini. Setelah copy, oke, kita akan gantinya dengan yang tadi. Oke, lihat. accept our cookie. Oke. Ups, sudah adakah live server? Kemarin sudah tak? Oke. Background color, backgroundnya aja. Untuk berapa? 5px dan jadi gimana adanya bug ya Allah tok nah oh sakit mata bisa font color colornya lebih harusnya review ini ya review gitu nih. Nah ini gue butuh review aja.
Good luck.
Yay. Skip.
So, really good job writing your first lines of CSS. That is no small accomplishment. Now I'm going to show you how I would design my cookie widget. So I want my widget to have cookie colors. So for my background property, which is what sets the background color of the body, which fills up the entire browser at this point, I'm going to choose a color called saddle brown, like that. And you might wonder, well, how do I know that saddle brown is a color that CSS supports? Well, you might have noticed as you wrote CSS values that VS Code, our editor, starts suggesting values for you as you start typing. So that is how I found saddle brown. This suggestion box here isn't recorded by Scrimba itself, so you won't see it in recording, but you will see it as you interact with the code yourself. So we have the background. Now let's move on to the next property, which is color, and that dictates the color of the text. It is set to red, though let's choose white here. That looks pretty good. The next one, font size, dictates, well, the size of the font. And here you can see we are using px values, which is short for pixels, and you can choose whatever value you want. Let's see what happens if we increase it up to 200. Oh, wow. That is far too big. So instead, let's try something like 25. Yeah, that's pretty good. Next, there's the font weight. You can choose between lighter, normal, or bold. And if we change this to bold, you'll see there that our text suddenly got a bit thicker, which is exactly what this property does. It changes the thickness of the font. Okay, text align. It is set to right, but we can also set it to left or center. Let's see what happens if we do left, and that bumped the text over to the left-hand side. I think we should have our cookie widget with centered text like that. Finally, margin top. What does that do? Well, if we try to change this to, for example, 50, you can see that, oh wow, that created more space here at the top. So it adds margin, aka spacing, at the top. And here I think maybe 50 was a bit too much. Let's do 30. Yeah, that is just right. Now, you probably ended at a completely different styling than this. That is okay. The point here was to experiment. Before you leave, I'll give you a sneak peek at another tool you can experiment with, and that is a different way of describing colors in CSS called hex codes. So here, I'll paste in this weird looking code starting with a hashtag, and as you can see, it created the exact same color. So this here is actually a recipe for the saddle brown color, and it's actually a description of 3 different things: how much red, green, and blue this saddle brown color consists of. So if I change this 8 here to 1 instead, you can see that completely changes the color. Now, if that is confusing, don't worry, you'll learn more about that later. I just wanted to give you a sneak peek on it. As with all of these other properties, you are going to get more comfortable with all of this, so it's not a problem at all if you completely forget about all of these properties and values. Over time, as you do it again and again, it'll become a part of your muscle memory. So with that, let's carry on.
Ding, 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 ding. Okay.
Now that you know enough CSS to be dangerous, let's use your newly acquired superpower in order to destroy Wikipedia. And for that, we need a Wikipedia page, and about the coolest one there is this list of helicopter prison escapes. I mean, oh my god, how insane is that? So click this image and you'll be taken to this article, and then I'll show you step by step how we can destroy it with CSS. So the first thing you need to do is to right click, so that'll open this menu where you can choose inspect, and once you click that, the dev tools will open. Then choose the icon in the far left, as that allows you to use your cursor to select elements on the page, so that when you hover over an element like this one, you'll see that the DevTools selects it for you. So if you move your cursor over to the logo, you'll see that one selected, and if you move your cursor over to the main part of the screen here, you can see it selects the entire article. Once you're on that selection, I want you to click, because that'll select the specific HTML element here in the Elements tab. And don't worry about all of this. You do not need to recognize the tags and attributes and everything you see here. What I instead want you to do is head over to the right-hand side where you see element.style. Click there and you'll be able to actually apply CSS directly to this page. So you can, for example, write background red, and boom, there we have really ruined this article. Then if you select another element on the page from this body content element here, you can do the exact same thing. Click on the element style, and now, for example, write font size and 30 pixels, and there you go. Now you can click on the X icon in the far right corner here, and then you can read about these helicopter prison escapes with a really bad background and huge text, if that's what you prefer. So feel free to spend an hour in this article, and then I will see you in the next scrim. Now that you know enough CSS to be dangerous,
Udahan nih. Ding, Steelseries file.
Okay, so now it's time for you to yet again build the google.com homepage. But this time around, you're also going to write the CSS so that you'll understand everything that goes into building this elegantly designed search engine. As you can see, I've set up the basic skeleton here in the HTML file for you. In the body tag, we have an image, which is pointing to the google.png image, which lies in the same directory as our index.html folder up here. And we have an input type text, which is our search field. And we're only going to start with these two elements, and then later move on to the buttons. Now, as you can see in the mini browser here, this looks horrible. It has no styling, so the logo is far too large, the input field doesn't look very good, so in short, there's a lot of work to do here. But before we can start writing CSS, you need to link to the CSS file. You can see I have a style CSS here, which just sets the background of the body to red, as a way of testing whether it is actually a link to the HTML. Currently, it's not. You are going to have to link to the CSS file on your own. And if you remember a couple of scrims back, I showed you how to do that. Though, please don't look back at that scrim in order to solve this challenge. Instead, Google it, because I do that almost every single time I have to link from an HTML file to a CSS file. So you should not be ashamed for Googling such a quote-unquote simple thing. Instead, just do that right now, because it's important practice. And then when you come back, I will show you how I would do it as well.
Okay. Nih, too much ya. Sizes version. Oh, gede banget loh. Oh, enggak ini. Width-nya. Persen. Tambahin teks. Oke, kita akan mulai dari sini. Kita akan ke bodinya dulu. Background colornya black white, color red, nah sudah red. Oke. Image. Line item center. Kita cari ya dulu. Salah. Nggak boleh AI. Margin auto. Oke. tipis 2.
Okay, hopefully that went well. Now, let's have a look at how we can solve this. So I would simply type how to link to CSS into Google and click at the top result. This happens to be a W3 Schools article. Here you can see that there's a few different ways you can import CSS into the HTML file, but we're only going to worry about the first one here called external CSS. As you can see, if we scroll a bit down, what we do is we type link rel equals style sheet and href with a pointer to the CSS file itself. So we'll do link rel equals style sheet, href equals styles.css, and then closing it. And if we now refresh the browser, boom, there we go. It is red, looking horrible. So we can remove that so that it looks white again, but now we know that we have linked the CSS and the HTML together, so we are ready to move on and start styling our page.
Ternyata kecepatan.
The first thing we want to fix in our example here are the widths of the elements, because if we compare it to the finished design, you can see that the input field is meant to be wider than the logo. However, in our example, that's not the case. Quite the opposite, actually. The logo is much wider than the input field. So we need to shrink the logo and then make the input field wider. So I'm going to start and do one of these, and then you will do the other. I happen to know that the width we want to have on this input field is 400 pixels. What I'm then going to do is target the input field using the element name and create a CSS selector, just writing input, then open and close curly bracket, and then simply write width and 400 px. And boom, there you can see, suddenly the input field widened quite a lot. And as you might have noticed, we're using this pixels value here again, which we've used a couple of times already actually. And if you're a little bit confused as to what a pixel is, you can think of it as the smallest unit of space that our screens can render. So a pixel is just a tiny square, so tiny that we actually need 400 of them stacked up besides each other in order to get a width of this size. So with that, I want you to fix the width of the Google logo. Select the image tag and set the width of the logo to 300 pixels. Go ahead and do that right now, and then I will show you how to do it as well when you return back to this scrim.
Skip sampai kita sudah.
Okay, let's do this. I'm gonna break this down into a few lines so I get some space above the input field, and then target the img element, the image element, open up the curly brackets, and do with 300 pixels, like that. Ooh! We're not quite yet at the finished design, but the ratio between the logo and the input field is now a lot better. Great job, let's move on. Okay, I've discovered a problem with our Google site, which is that if we make the browser really wide, you can see that suddenly the items stack up besides each other on the same line. And that's obviously not the kind of behavior we want. We want them to always be stacked on top of each other. And in order to fix this, you have to learn about inline elements versus block elements. And that's best understood through the lens of an example. So let's say that you, for example, have a collection of things you want to showcase. You could be like George Franzen, for example, and collect dinosaur poo. He actually has the world's largest collection of fossilized feces, and naturally he wants to exhibit them in a museum. And if he were to use display inline on his images, they would stack up besides each other, like this. So kind of like in a line, horizontally. However, had he used display block on his images, then they would stack up on top of each other. So a rule of thumb is display block stacks on top. Another way to look at this is that the block level element blocks out the rest of the available horizontal space so that nothing else can be placed there. And that is regardless of how wide this image is, the content itself. Display block requires control over all the horizontal space in its given container. So when this block image is placed here and you add a new image, it would have to be placed underneath the previous one. And if it is display block as well, it'll block out the rest of the available horizontal space, and the next image have to be placed below that one again, and so on. So the solution is obviously to turn these elements into blocks. And I'm just going to give you the syntax here. This is how you write it, display : block. Go ahead and do that for both of these and observe what happens to the example when you make the browser wide. Good luck. Okay, let's do this. So I'll do display block up here, and the same here. If we look at the browser, seemingly nothing has happened. However, if we now make it wide, you can see, yes, no matter how wide the browser is, these will always stack up on top of each other. So, great job, let's move on. The next thing we need to fix is the lack of white space above our Google logo. Because if we take a look at the design here, we want quite a lot of space in between the top of the browser and the logo. And I'm not going to tell you how to add that, but if you can think back to the very first scrim in this section, we added some space above the text in our cookie widget. And that specific space is called margin, or margin top to be specific. So your job is to add some margin on top of our image. Right here, you can start on line 7. So that our example here gets some breathing room, some white space above the logo and the input field. Go ahead and give this one a shot, and then I will of course show you the solution when you return back to me. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries. I really pushed you out on thin ice here, so it's completely okay if you didn't remember that the property is called margin top, and what you add there is a pixel value. So for example, 100px, and there we go. We've now added a margin on the top of our image, and while we're still quite far off from our provided design here, we are getting closer. Great job, let's move on. Now, while it... It totally works to add the margin top directly on the image here. You'd most likely not see professional developers do this, because what they do instead is wrap these two elements in some kind of container and then control the positioning of these elements indirectly via that container. And in order to do this, you have to learn about the div. I'm going to create an opening div and then indent these two, and then a closing div below here. Now, if we run this code, seemingly nothing has happened, because the div actually does very little in itself, though it is indispensable for web developers. Just to show you how important it is, let's take a look at Facebook and my timeline. Here I've opened up DevTools and inspected one of the timeline items, and you can see it is actually a div inside of a div, inside of another div, inside of yet another div, inside of a div, inside of a div. Whew. Divs really do rule the world, so it's important that you learn about them. And the way we'll use this div now is by removing the margin top styling from the image and then add it to the div itself. And the reason this is important is, let's say that, for example, Google decides to create a video here instead, or a interactive doodle or some kind of game. They often play around with the Google logo. Well, if so, it's a really bad idea that it is the image itself that controls the margin from the top of the browser and down to the content, because that image might be removed. So it is a solution that'll get you into trouble in the future. So what we'll do here is we'll simply instead target the div and then remove the margin top from the image, and boom, it has popped up. Now we lost all of our white space, but if we add it back to our div, we are back at the design we started out with. Seemingly nothing has changed, but as you know, we have a better HTML structure. So we have definitely made good progress here. So with that, let's move on to the next scrim. The reason you need to learn about classes now is because our current setup, where we simply have the elements like this, and then selecting the elements using the element selector in CSS, will give us bugs down the line. Because when we add the two buttons beneath the input field, we'll actually wrap these two in a div as well. And let's see what happens at this point. What I'll do now is simply add the HTML for these buttons down here beneath the input field. So it is a div with two buttons inside of it. And then you can see we are closing that div, the inner div, and then we are closing the outer div. Let's run this code. And oh wow! What you can see is that the spacing between the input field and the buttons is totally off. And that is because our CSS element selector here selects any div it can find in the HTML document and applies the margin top to it. So it doesn't just select the first one, but it can select thousands of divs. So this is a very generic solution and likely not something we want to use, as we want to have multiple divs with different types of styling in our HTML element. So let's now instead fix this by doing the following. I'll write class equals, and then for example, main. This here is an attribute called class, so it's built into HTML. And this here is the name I'm giving my class. I want to call this div my main element. And now the way I select that in the CSS is by, instead of just writing the element name, simply doing dot main, like that. Now, if I rerun this code, you can see now the margin top is only applied to the outer div, our main class, and not to the div which wraps the two buttons. So that is exactly what we needed. Now, I'm going to remove these two buttons here because we don't want to deal with them just yet. And then I'm going to give you a challenge. First, you're going to add a class to each of these two elements. That is the image and the input. You have to decide what you will call the two classes, but make sure to give them different names. And then you're going to, in the CSS, replace the element selectors with class selectors. So that is the IMG selector here and the input selector here. And obviously, the CSS class selectors you're going to replace them with is the ones you have added to the elements right here. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's now do it together. So for the image tag, I'm simply going to do class equals, then I'll call this logo dash img. So here I'm using a convention where I'm first giving my class a descriptive name and then using a dash and then specifying the element as well. This is an img element, but it could have been, for example, an svg or something else. Now, I don't expect you to have followed the same convention. There are plenty of CSS conventions, and it doesn't matter at all what you used in your example. You can call your classes whatever you want. Okay, for the input, we'll do class equals search dash input, like that. Okay, let's move through the CSS. Then I'll replace this with dot. Now you can see it broke the layout because this styling now is not applied to any element. So we need to do logo dash img like that, and here do dot search dash input. And there we have the exact same example, didn't change at all, but we now have a more flexible solution that scales better. So great job solving this challenge. Let's move on. Okay, now it's time to take a closer look at margins. And you've already dipped your toes into this as you have used margin top, so you might have some intuition about what margins do. However, now you're going to learn it properly through creating flags with CSS, because flags are just awesome. I mean, take a look at this flag here, for example, from the Republic of Venice, a state which existed for over 1,000 years in Europe, and it contains, of course, a flying lion holding a book. I mean, what's more natural than that? Or this one right here, for the Isle of Man. I mean, have you ever seen a more creepy creature than this three-legged thing right here? Imagine having that thing running after you. That would not be fun, and this flag would be really hard to create in CSS actually, so we're not going to create this one. We're going to start off at a much easier level with just some very simple shapes. So let's have a look at those actually. Here is what we're going to work with. As you can see, there's simply 3 divs inside of the body tag, and each div has a class, red, blue, or green. If we check out the styles.css, you can see that these 3 classes apply a background color to each of the elements and sets the height to 100 pixels. And here we have the result, 3 rectangular boxes that are stacked on top of each other. And that tells us that these are display block, because display block stacks on top. There's one thing that bothers me here, and that is that we have a little bit of white space around the 3 items. Why is that? Well, actually, it's because our browser is trying to help us here. It's assuming that we want a little bit of space around the body tag so that these 3 don't touch the edges of the browser. So what's actually going on here in code is that the browser targets the body and sets a margin of 8 pixels. If you notice, when I added this, nothing changed. So if I remove this, it's still the same, meaning that this style here is applied automatically. So that means that margin is actually the space around an element. Because now if we change this to 0, boom, there you can see, suddenly our divs touch the edges of the browser. Now, here at the bottom, they stop after 300 pixels since we've told them to. So this margin 0 here seemingly didn't change anything at the bottom, because the bottom contains white space anyway, if we make our browser tall enough. But anyway, that's a digression. Let's get it back so that the browser is completely filled up with these 3 items. And now let's play a little bit around with margins. So what do you think will happen if I add a margin top of 10 pixels on the red here? Take a guess. Okay, margin top, 10 pixels, boom! It added 10 pixels on the top. What do you think will happen if I add margin left 10 pixels as well? Let's try it. Okay, so it added 10 pixels on the left-hand side. It's only on the red rectangle, not the blue or green rectangle. Likewise, if I do margin right, 10 pixels, it adds 10 pixels to the right-hand side as well. If I do 100, it eats up almost a third of our red rectangle. Okay, so now it's your turn. I want you to add 100 pixels of margin on the bottom of the red box. So go ahead and give that a shot right now. Okay, if you did margin bottom 100 px like that, I want to congratulate you because you just created the flag of Monaco. Really good job creating your first CSS flag. And now let's do that yet again. Here is your challenge. You are going to create the flag of the Gambia. And here we have that flag. However, there's a catch. You can only do this by applying styles to the blue box. So by adding margin to this CSS rule right here.
Oh, sorry. Sebentar.
So go ahead and give that a shot right now.
Kita mau bikin gini. Oke, boleh di biru.
Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do it is by doing margin top. Let's try 10 pixels and see. Actually, I think we want our white space to be a little bit more than 10 pixels. So let's do 20 like that. And then margin bottom as well, 20 pixels. And there, I think we have a pretty good flag for the Gambia. Now, before we move on to our Google project, there's one little weird thing I want to tell you about margin top and bottom. Because what do you think happens if I add, for example, margin bottom of 15 to this red element here? Well, according to my logic, the margin right here would be 35 pixels. Because we added 20 pixels on top of the blue, and if we add 15 at the bottom of the red one, that should be 35 pixels in total. However, now that I added this, nothing happened. And that is because margin top and margin bottom will, in many situations, collapse into each other. So that as long as this margin is smaller than this will take precedence. And it's only when this one becomes larger, for example 25, that it will kick in. So let's take it back to 15. And to make things even worse, there's actually scenarios where this doesn't happen. However, digging into that is outside of the scope of this lecture. I just want you to be aware of it, because if you're suddenly in a situation where your margins don't seem to add up, it is probably because of so-called collapsing margins. Okay, with that, let's move on. Okay, we're back at our Google project. I want to give you a quick challenge. I want you to add some space between the logo and the search field, because as you can see here, there's some spacing in between the elements in our design. However, in our project now, they are crammed together. There are two ways you can do this using margins, and I want you to think about which two ways that is, and choose one of them. Go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do it. So you can either add a margin bottom to the logo, or you can add a margin top to the search field.
Oh,
I'm going to go with adding margin bottom to the logo, as I think either way is as good as the other at this stage. Margin bottom, and how much do we want to add? Well, let's try 20px. And yeah, as you can see, we've got some spacing. The bottom of the G is not touching the top of the input field. And if we compare that to the example, I think it looks more or less the same. So, great job. Let's move on. Okay, now you are going to learn about centering elements in CSS, and that is a scary topic for a lot of developers. So scary that this Stack Overflow question about how to horizontally center an element has been viewed 4.5 million times. So if you think this is a little bit confusing, you are in very good company, so don't worry about it. So with that in mind, let's move over to our example. You are going to center this dinosaur poo. As you can see in the CSS, it has just one property set at this point, which is a width of 200 pixels. That is because the image is so wide originally that if I don't set that width, it'll just take up more space than we have available. And setting the width of it is actually an important thing in order to center it, because there are three things that need to be in place when we are to center elements with the technique you are about to learn, aka centering with margins. And these three components are: first, the element needs to be display block, because how is an element supposed to center itself if it doesn't command full control over all the horizontal space? If it's display inline and allows other elements to stack themselves besides the element, well, then it won't be able to center itself because that space now is busy with other things. So in order to center this poo, it needs to control all the horizontal space. So it needs this block like that. Now that didn't change anything, but under the hood, the poo now controls the full horizontal space. Okay, the second part is that it must have a width. And that is what we've done here already, because how is this item supposed to be centered inside the browser if it is wider than the browser itself? That's often what happens with either large elements or with some HTML elements who just naturally actually expand to take up all the available space in the block. So we have to make sure that our element has a width. And finally, we set the margin on the left-hand side and the right-hand side to the value auto. Let's just do that. Margin left, auto. Oh wow. Now it pushed the poo all the way to the right-hand side. Because auto here means take up all the available space. And since this is a block element, the available space is all the space that's left after the poo has taken up its 200 pixels. So it just ate up all of this space and turned it into margin. However, at this point, margin right enters the party. Margin right, and says, I want the available space as well. And at that point, the margin left and margin right goes into a discussion and decides, well, actually, since there are two of us here, pushing on each of the side of the element, trying to get all of the available white space, let's just divide it evenly amongst both of us. And the result, well, it is that the item is centered. So that was a long explanation of centering with margins. If you feel confused, don't worry about it right now. All you need to do is remember these three conditions and just be aware of the 4.5 million other developers who are in or have been in the same boat as you. Let's move on to the next script. Okay, we are back at our Google project. Now your challenge is to center the logo and the search field using the technique you just learned. So go ahead and give that a shot right now, and then I will of course show you the solution afterwards as well. Okay, as you hopefully remembered, the way to center an element, which is display block and has a width, is by adding margin left auto and margin right auto. So let's do that. Margin left auto. And as you can see, that pushes the logo all the way to the right hand side because the margin left is set to auto and it takes up as much space as it can. We'll do the same thing with the right hand side. Do margin right, auto. Then the right hand side starts pushing back again, and when they're both taking up equally as much space, the margin left and margin right kind of decides, yeah, let's not argue anymore. Now we have a nice balance, and whoa, lo and behold, our element is centered. So now what we can do is be super lazy and copy that code and paste it in down here, and boom, our input field is centered as well. And our project is starting to look a little bit like our finished design. So this is super cool. Let's just keep up the pace and move on. We need to take a little step back and learn a new CSS concept, which is the close relative of margins called padding. And we're of course going to learn that through the lens of an example. So here I have just a simple div, which contains a little bit of text, or specifically, the two first sentences in the white paper behind Bitcoin. And let's say we want to turn this into a nice looking card that people can read. If so, we'd probably create a class and call it card. And then of course in the style.css, we'd select that card and apply the styling. As for now, it just has one property set, which is the color that we've set to a shade of black that isn't pure black, but a little bit softer, so to speak. That is because by default, the browser uses pure black as the text color and pure white as the background color. And as a rule of thumb, you never want to have pure black on pure white, because that's not a pleasant experience for the eyes. So instead, we went for this. But that was a digression. Let's move on with turning this into a nice looking card. So a card needs a background color. So let's just do background light gray, for example, like that. And we also don't want our card to be full width, because as you remember, divs are block by default and take up the full width if you don't specify any width on it. So we're going to do with, for example, 300 pixels like that. And then we also want some space above the card. That is, of course, margin top. Let's push it 50 pixels down from the top. And finally, it should be centered. So let's do margin left, auto, and margin right. Like that. Okay, so now we have something that looks at least a little bit like a card. But there's one problem here. You can see the text is crammed all the way into the edges of the div, which doesn't look particularly good. And that is where padding comes into play. So now I'm just going to apply the padding by doing padding, and for example, 20 pixels, like that. And as you can see, that created a little bit of space, basically some breathing room in between the text and the edge of our div container here. And if I do 50, you can see it's even more breathing room. So whereas margin adds space on the outside of our div, the card which we've selected here, padding will add space on the inside, in between the content and the edges of the container or the div. So margin kind of lives up here and down here, if we are to visualize this in our HTML, whereas padding lives on the inside of our element. That is here and here. And now you might wonder, well, why did I just write padding? Whereas for margin, we're specifying each of the sides. And well, you can do exactly that on padding as well. This padding 20 pixels right here is the exact same thing as writing the following. Padding top 20, bottom 20, left 20, and right 20. So with these 4 lines, we can actually delete this one up here. And then we have the same convention as we're using with margins. It's just that you can use padding 20 pixels like that if all of the values are the same. It's basically a shorthand. And now that we have all of them written out, we can play around a little bit with it. Perhaps add a 100 pixels on the left-hand side. It looks really weird, and 100 pixels on the top as well. And suddenly our card does not look very good. But let's get it back. And now I want to give you a challenge. I want you to add padding to make our card look like the provided design. And the provided design is right here. You can see it's a completely broken card, as we've been ruthless about our padding. And I've actually removed all of the padding rules from the CSS, as I want you to build some muscle memory right.
Oke. Kok dimatiin? Pengen ya lah. Ini nih, sini nih, ya kan. Apa nih? Apa? Ini aja loh. Pengen seperti di si tadi lah. Enak kayak gini. Kan udah gini. Padding. Top. Atas dan atas sama satu yes kanan 200 nah gini dapat 1000 ini kan bisa gua
Padding. So go ahead and make this card look like it does in the slide, and then return back to me once you've done it.
Oke, kita lanjut.
Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, let's do it together. As you can see here, it's completely crammed into the bottom left corner, which means that it doesn't have any padding on the left-hand side or any padding on the bottom, but a ton of padding on the top and a ton of padding on the right. So I'm just gonna do padding top, 100 pixels, something like that. Yeah, seems pretty much what we have in the design as well. And then do the same, padding right, 100 pixels, like that. And to me, that looks actually pretty much like our design. I don't need to write padding bottom or padding left now, though I could do it. I could do padding bottom 0 pixels, or just 0, and padding left 0 as well. Though that didn't change anything, so it's actually not needed, because by default, the padding of a div is 0. So, however you solved this, great job, let's move on. So now you've learned about controlling the space on the outside of the element with the margin and on the inside of the element with the padding. But wouldn't it be nice if we could also control the border in between the margin and the padding? And it turns out we can, through, you guessed it, the border property. Because if I write border here, and then specify, for example, 2 pixels thickness, solid, in shape, and then color red. You can see then we get a border which is on the outside of the padding but on the inside of the margin. And if we change any of these 3 values here, it'll update accordingly. So let's try 8 pixels width instead. You can see it's much thicker now. Instead of solid, we can do dotted like that. Pretty weird. And instead of red, we can do, for example, FFF, white in hexadecimal. Or just write white like that, or just blue so it's a little bit clearer. Now, there are many types of borders, but in 99.9% of the cases, you want to use solid like that. And also, very often, you'd want to soften up these corners. And you can do that with the border radius property. And here you specify a pixel value, for example, 30 pixels, and boom, there you can see we have this much softer corners. If we crank this up to 100 or 1000, it stops at some point because then the edges have simply turned into half circles. So at some point, there's no use going any higher. Now, this looks pretty bad. So what I want you to do now is fix it up so that it looks like this. And I'm not going to give you any of the values I've used here. Just a little hint. I took an already existing color in our box and so now you've looked, you can do that with the much soft. Now, this is colors and not have too many different colors. So if you think this is pure black, you are wrong. So go ahead and change the values of the border and border radius so that our example here matches the design I've provided in the slide. Good luck. Okay, hopefully that went well. So let's start with the border. 8 pixels here looks a bit too thick for me, so let's try 4 instead, like that. I think that matches better, yes. And the color, I gave you a hint, was just the blackish color we have for our text, like that. And the border radius is much smaller. Let's try 10. This still looks a little bit rounder, so let's try 20. Yes, there, I think we got it. Great job. Now, a cool thing to do in order to inspect the margin, border, padding, and size of the element in general is to open up the dev tools, which can be done by right-clicking on the nav bar here, and then clicking in Spec, and then this dev tools panel will open. Here, clicking on the select icon on the left-hand side, and then hovering over the element, finally clicking at it, there you will see that we have selected the element in the Elements tab, and under the Styles tab, you can see the styling we have applied using CSS. So here you can actually modify them if you want. But we're not going to do that right now. We're going to scroll down and verify that our margin, border, and padding are correct. So if I hover over the margin here, you can see up here in the mini browser, it is marked in orange, and the values are provided down in the box here. If I move over to the border, you can see that border is now selected in the browser. And it is indeed 4 pixels as we coded up a minute ago. If I move over to the padding, you can see that is also indeed 20 on each side, just as we want it to be. And finally, if I hover over the center here, the content is highlighted, and the content of this div is just the text. And as you can see, it is 300 pixels wide, just as we set it as, so it's working as expected. And the height is dictated by how many lines of text are 2 sentences required. So, using this technique of inspecting an element and its sizing properties like this is a really good way of debugging if something, for example, looks wrong, because it gives you an ability to verify if the numbers here match up with what you've tried to write in your CSS. So, now that you've learned all of that, I want to tell you the name of this, and it's actually called the box model. And to be honest, I've never really liked this word. It sounds more complex than it is, in my opinion. It's just spacing around the element, a border, spacing on the inside of an element, and the content itself. But in web development, we call this the box model. So you'll probably hear this name come up from time to time, but you shouldn't fear it. You know exactly what it is and you've used all of the properties in the box model, so don't worry about it. Actually, let's give you a new box model practice in the next scrim. I'll see you there. Okay, now you are going to create a really neat looking button, namely the following button on Twitter. Let's zoom in a little bit and here you can see it. This is the button you see if you already are following someone, and if we zoom out again, this is the Scrimbot Twitter profile. You should definitely just click this image and follow us because we share a ton of useful tips and tricks and career advice for aspiring coders here, so it's definitely worthwhile. Anyway, now you are going to use the things you've learned about padding, border radius, and so forth in order to make this button right here with the ugly default styling look exactly like this. Or not exactly, as we're not going to worry about the font. It is a little bit different, but other than that, you should try to make it look identical. I've given you some hints here. For example, the border color is this hex color right here, and the text color is this one right here. And also, you need to remember to adjust the font weight. And I don't think you've done that ever since the very first scrim where you wrote your first lines of CSS. So you might have to look back so that you figure out how to adjust. The font weight, or you can Google it, up to you. Anyway, just go ahead and give this your best shot, and if you at some point get stuck or don't know how to do it, no worries, we are going to do it. Do it together afterwards as well. Good luck.
background colornya white. Gitu.
Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do it together. I'm going to target the button just using an element selector like this. And now let's pick the low-hanging fruit, namely the ones we've gotten here already. For example, by doing color, and then copying this color right here. Okay, that didn't change much, at least not visibly. Then let's do border. And I'm going to start with 1 pixel solid. And then the border color right here. Like that. Okay, so it looks a little bit different now, but not quite this. One thing we can clearly see is that this image has a white background, whereas ours is still a little bit gray. So let's do that as well. Background white. Okay, yes. But our button is much more crammed. There's too little padding. Whereas here you can see we have a little bit of padding on the top and the bottom, and actually quite a lot of padding on the left and right hand side. And that's actually a little design tip right there. What you'll often see is that buttons have more padding on the left-hand side and the right-hand side than they have above and below. So let's try padding top 5 pixels, for example, padding bottom 5 pixels, and then we'll try left 10 pixels and right 10 pixels as well. How does that look? Not too bad, but actually it looks like this button has even more. So we've added half as much on the top and bottom as we have on the sides. So let's crank up both of these a little bit. I'm going to select both of these and do 8 top and below. and select both of these and do 16 left and right. Yeah, I think that's more like it. Now, one thing that definitely is remaining is the rounded edges here. So that is the border radius. Add it up here with the border. Let's try 10 pixels. It's a little bit round now, but not as round as the Twitter button. So let's do 16. Yeah, more like it. Can we go higher? Yeah, I think we can go to 18. That looks quite good to me if we compare it to this one. And then finally, we needed to remember the font weight, which I can do font weight bold, like that. And that looks a lot better. I think the final adjustment I want to make is adding even a little bit more padding around it, because now that I look at it, it feels like this is a bit more spacious. So here we are really in the nitpicking area, but let's try 10 on both of the top and bottom, and let's try 20 on the left and right. And what's interesting now is that since the box now has grown in size because it's affected by the padding, the border radius can also be cranked up a little bit. I think actually we can do 20 now. Yes, because the bigger a box is, more pixels you need to add in order to get this fully soft looking button, which essentially has 2 half circles on each of its sides. So, looking at the example and comparing it with ours, I think we have reached our goal. And if your values are different than mine, that does not matter at all. You're actually creating the button of a huge public company here. You are just learning basic CSS, so it's totally not expected that you create buttons as neatly as Twitter does, as they probably have a team of developers and designers working just on this profile page. So, however it went, be proud of yourself and get ready to move on with our Google project. I'll see you in the next scrim. Okay, we are back at our Google project, and now you are going to fix the design of our search field. And you're actually going to get a design spec and a proper walkthrough of how I want it to look. So here, I've opened up the dev tools, actually on the right-hand side, as I want to inspect the box model of this element with you. And if you wonder how I managed to stick the dev tools to the right-hand side here, just click these 3 icons if you're in Chrome, then you can choose the dock side. So let's move on down here to the box model of the input field. And if I hover over the content in the box model here, you can see that it says 400 pixels times 24 pixels. And you can see the content is marked in blue in the mini browser here. So that means that our width is 400 pixels. We know that because we set it ourselves here. And the height of the content should be 24 pixels. Okay, let's move on to the padding. If I hover over that, you can see it's green and it's highlighted in green in the mini browser. The padding at the top and the bottom are 10 pixels, as you can see down here, and the left-hand side and right-hand side have 30 pixels each. And then if we move over to the border, you can see that it's simply 1 pixel all around. So here is your design spec given to you by your hipster designer down in the bottom right corner here. Height of content, 24 pixels. But do remember that that is actually the height of the inner box here, not the height of the total input field, as that also contains the padding and the border. But the height property should be 24 pixels. The padding above and beyond, as said, 10 pixels. Right and left hand side, 30 pixels. Thickness of border, 1 pixel. The color of border is this. And then finally also the border radius is also a value that our designer has been kind enough to give to you. So, take this design spec and implement it using CSS. Also, the border radius is also a value. Okay, it also contains the went well. If not, no worries, we'll do this together right now. So starting with the height of 24. There I'm going to just write height 24 pixels, like that. Okay, so it became a little bit taller now. Next step is the padding top and bottom was 10 pixels. So padding top 10px, bottom was also 10px, like that. Okay, the padding left and right hand side were 30 pixels according to the spec, so let's implement that, like that. And then we'll move on to the border. 1 pixel and this hex code right here. So I'll do border, and here we have to provide it with 3 values, so 1 pixel. It is going to be solid, and the color is DFE1E5, like that, looking pretty good. The final thing then is the border radius, and that should be 24 pixels according to the design. And look at this, it is starting to look really professional. So really good job if you did this challenge. And if you did a couple of mistakes, no worries at all. Actually, I also did a little mistake here according to best practices when setting heights for input fields, because actually I want to show you that this height of 24 pixels here is actually not the way we want to do it. Because if I Google set height of input field CSS and then click the first link, that is a Stack Overflow question. And here you can see someone who's been having problems with this, so they've asked a question about it. If we scroll a little bit down, you can see that people are saying try with padding and line height. Line height, that's not something we've used. If we scroll a little bit down, you can see that some browsers will honor a CSS height rule, some not. So it seems to be a little bit difficult to use height for the input field. And this person as well suggests line height, and likewise with this third person here. So I'm going to trust the wisdom of the crowds here and use line height instead. Like that. It didn't change anything, but we are using a property that more browsers apparently will honor. And line height is actually just the height of one line of text. And since that is everything we have inside of an input field, it's just one line of text, that'll be the exact same thing as setting the height of the inner content of the input field. So if that was a little bit confusing and you prefer to just use height, that's totally fine as well. It's more important that you are using what you are comfortable with than that you are doing it the 100% correct way according to conventions. So just use whatever you want. I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that this is the recommended way according to Stack Overflow. With that, let's move on. Okay, we are back at our Google project, and now you are going to fix the design of our search field. And you're actually going to get a design spec and a proper walkthrough of this is the recommended way according to Stack Overflow. With that, let's move on. Okay, now we're going to add the first button to our Google project. So I'm going to head over to the HTML, and here beneath the input field, I'm just going to type button like that, and this will be the Google search button. So there we have it. It doesn't exactly look good, but don't worry about that. Now I want to give this a class as well, and a class name you'll often see used for buttons is simply btn, like that. Okay, now that we have that, I want you to center the button and add some space above it. So go ahead and use the class selector to select this button and solve this challenge. Good luck. Okay, so what I'll do is do .btn to select the button. Here, you might have been tempted to simply do margin left auto and then margin right auto. However, that doesn't seem to do anything. Why is that? Well, if you remember the criteria you needed in order to use this technique to center elements, one of them was that you need your element to be display block, whereas buttons are actually display inline by default. So if we do display block, boom, there we go. The button is centered. And now you might ask, well, what about the width? We also set the width on the input field and the logo. Well, we could do that as well with this one. Let's do width 200 pixels, for example. However, it's not needed because if we remove the width, you can see that it still has a width, which is certainly not full width across the entire page. So it kind of has an implicit width without us setting the width. So even though it is a criteria that your element needs a width in order to use this technique here in order to center it, you don't necessarily have to set the width yourself if the element already has some kind of width. So it works perfectly fine just doing display block and margin left right auto in this example. Finally, we are going to add some space above it. So let's do that. I'll do margin top and do, for example, 30 pixels. Yeah, looking pretty good. Great job solving this challenge. Let's move on. Now we are going to style the button in our Google project. Because as you can see, this is how our button currently looks, but this is how we want it to look. So we got to do a bunch of changes. However, there's one thing I want to change actually on this google.com homepage. Because notice how low the contrast is between the background color of the button and the background color of the entire website. It's hardly possible to see that there's any difference. And that's not good because it reduces the accessibility of the site and makes it hard for people who are visually impaired to use it. And actually, to prove this, let's take these two colors, the light gray here and the white, and put them into a contrast checker online. For example, this one right here on userway.org. They have this nice little contrast checker where you can paste in the foreground color and the background color and then get a contrast ratio. And this F8, F9, FA hex color is the one that Google is using. And if we scroll a bit down, you'll see that Google indeed fails miserably on this test. Complete failure. The ratio is 1.05, though it should have been 4.5 or more. So not good, Google. So what we will do instead is change the background from this to something like this. Here you can see it's much easier to see that it is indeed a button. So even though the real background color is this one right here, we are going to use this one right here. So with that in mind, I want you to style the button according to the provided design you now have. And the only hint I'll give you is that these are the properties you are going to use. However, I'm not giving you the values of any of them because I want you to practice looking at an example and making your best guess as to what the values for the CSS properties should be, as that's how you'll work out in the real world when a designer, for example, gives you a design file. So go ahead and do this right now.
Okay. Style the button property just by heading
And then I will show you this here, have it on the side so that we can see how it develops. And then start with the background color, as we have the value for that one. Down here. Round. Like that. Okay. Next, I would try to see what is the most apparent difference between this button and this one right here. Well, the border is certainly different. This button does not have a border at all, whereas this one has a border. So let's just remove it. Border. None. Like that. Okay, good. Now we can see that the text is much more crammed into this box than it is on this one right here. So that is the padding. And also you can notice that there's more padding on the left and right hand side than on the top and bottom. So I'm going to try to add, for example, padding top 5 pixels. That actually looks like this one here has more than 5 pixels because this space is still pretty crammed. So I'm going to do, for example, 8. Yeah, I think that is more like it. I'm going to give that on the bottom as well. Like that. On the sides, I'm just going to try the double. Padding left, 16 pixels. Padding right, 16 pixels. And you know what? I think that button and our button looks pretty similar in size. So next up is the border radius, because you can see this one is totally rectangular, whereas this one has softer corners. So I'm going to do border radius, something like 4 pixels. So that is pretty good. The final minor adjustments I'm going to make is reduce the font size ever so little from what it is here down to what it is here. I mean, it's almost identical, but I happen to know that this one is indeed 14 pixels. So I'm going to do font size 14 pixels like that. And there we actually have the buttons, this one and this one, identical. Now, if you chose any other values than the ones I've chosen, don't worry about it at all. The point was not for you to reach the exact same values as me, but just in the same range, basically. So regardless of how your example ended up, good job reaching this far. Let's just keep up the pace and move on. Now we are going to add the second button to our Google project. This I'm feeling lucky button right here. And I want you to do that on your own first. So that's your challenge. Add the next button. And do remember to give that button a btn class so that it's styled as our search button. And once you've done that and executed the code, I want you to take a look in the mini browser and ask yourself, why aren't our buttons behaving as we want them to? Because as you'll see, there's something wrong with the layout, at least when comparing it to this layout right here. So go ahead and do that right now and try to think of why our layout is wrong, and then I will do it as well when you return back to me and explain what's going on. Okay, let's do this. So I'm lazy, so I'm just going to copy this one like that and write feeling lucky. Run the code, and as you can see, the buttons are now stacked on top of each other. What we can do in order to figure out what's going on here is actually use the built-in dev tools in the browser, which you've seen a few times now. So let me show you this debug session using slides. I'm going to right-click in the nav bar and then choose Inspect, open up the Elements tab, and then click on the selector icon here so that I can select this button by hovering over it. And then down in the Styles tab, I can scroll down until I see the box model for our button. And what you'll notice is that our button is taking up all the available space on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And if we move down to the second button, you can see that that button is also doing that. That is because they are display block. Exactly this line right here. If you remember from previous lectures, display block kind of takes up all of the available space on the horizontal axis. So as we said earlier, display block stacks on top. We aren't able to get the layout we want if our buttons are display block. And then you might be tempted to do, well, let's just remove the display block. However, if we do, they will be on the same line. Yes, they are now inline elements, but they will just be crammed all the way to the left-hand side because margin left right auto doesn't work. If you remember from the lecture about centering, you learned that display block and margin left right auto works together in order to center something. You can't have just one of them. Which means that in order to go from this layout to this layout, we have to use a different technique for centering the elements. And there's actually two ways we could do this. There's the simple and inflexible way using text align, and then there's the slightly harder but super flexible way using Flexbox. And since you're going to use Flexbox several times throughout this course, I want you to get familiar with it right away. So in the next scrim, we're going to talk about Flexbox, but before we do that, I just want to show you the simple way as well so that you've seen it. Because as you might remember from one of the very first scrims in this section, we used something called text align in order to align our text either to the left, right, or center. Now, the text align property actually works on all inline elements, not just on text. So what we can do is remove the display block from our buttons. As you know, that turns them into inline elements and they are crammed to the left. And as inline elements only take up the available space they need according to their content, there is no available margin to use. So auto here, which basically means take up whatever available margin there is, serves no purpose. So we can remove both of these two as well. As you can see, it made no difference. And then we can move up to the main, the parent. So we'll do text align, center, like that, and boom, both buttons are now centered. So here we have told the container, the main element, all inline elements inside of it should align to the center. So that was the easy but inflexible way of doing this. Let's, instead of using this technique, move on to do it how the pros do it using Flexbox. Flexbox is everywhere. Let's just have a look at Twitter, for example. Here, the menu on the left-hand side is created with Flexbox, as with the tweet options menu and the timeline itself. And guess what the trends for you and who to follow is created with? You guessed it, Flexbox. So this is something you need to learn. Let's imagine then that you have an e-commerce website, which you can see here, that sells shoes, hoodies, and t-shirts. Well, then you'd probably have a navigation menu like this one, where users can click and then probably open up a sub-menu or something like that. As you can see, the items stack on top of each other. That is to be expected, as these are divs, and divs are display block. They want to take up all the available space in the width. And if you're wondering how I styled these, we can head over to the styles.css and just have a quick look at that. You can see I've aligned the text to the center inside of all the items. Hadn't I done that, it would have been aligned to the left. Also, there's a border, as you can see. There's some padding on the inside, and there's some margin in between the elements. Now the question is, what if I, instead of this vertical layout, wanted a horizontal layout, which is more common for so-called navigation bars? So something that looks like this. Well, this is where Flexbox comes to the rescue. And in order to turn this into a Flexbox layout, I would first have to wrap these three items in a container, because a Flexbox layout always consists of a container and its direct children. So let's wrap it in a div, and give this a class of, for example, nav-wrapper, like that. If I run this now, nothing happens, because divs, as you know, are invisible unless you give them any styling or content. So let's head over to the styles.css, and now target the nav wrapper like that. In order to turn this into a Flexbox container, all I have to do is write display flex, and boom. Suddenly, we have forced our three divs into one row. Now this layout flows from left to right along the horizontal axis. And that is pretty significant, given that these items were display block by default. But Flexbox, as powerful as it is, overrides that and forces them onto one line. However, we haven't got quite the layout we want yet. As you can see, it's centered, and there's also some space in between the items. Now, let's start with the centering, because Flexbox now has control over these items and can decide where along the main axis they should be positioned. So we can do justify content. That is a little bit of a weird name for a property, but that's just how it is. And then set that to center, like that. Now all of the items are centered. And the final step is just to get some spacing in between these items, and that is done with our good old friend margin. So we'll do margin left, let's do 10 pixels, and let's add the same thing on the margin right, like that. And there we have the layout we wanted. Now a final cool thing I want to show you is that we can do, for example, end here as well, and that'll push it all the way to the right hand side, or start at the beginning, or alternatively, do space dash around. That's pretty cool. Now we've distributed all the white space around each of the items. And another one is space between. Now all of the available space is between the items, so they're spread out like this. Now we are getting ahead of ourselves here. I just wanted to demonstrate this to show how powerful Flexbox is. What you are going to work with is the center here. So with that, let's return back to our Google clone. Okay, we are back at our Google project, and now your job is to... to center these two buttons besides each other, meaning getting to this layout right here. And the way to do that is, of course, using Flexbox. So you'll wrap the two buttons in a Flexbox div and then center them. And then also, I want you to give the div a class of btn-wrapper. So you'll need to modify both the HTML and the CSS here. Now, before you start, I'm going to remove these three lines here because they are solely there in order to center our buttons using this display block and margin left-right auto technique. However, now we're going to use the Flexbox technique. And we don't want to use both techniques at the same time because that'll just be confusing as they will affect each other. So I will remove these lines, and now you're left with this left-aligned layout here. So please take over here, do this challenge, and then return back to me when you've done it or when you feel you need some guidance. Good luck. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, we'll do it now together. So I'm going to start with this Flexbox div that we want in our HTML. It should wrap our buttons and only our buttons. So we want to start it up here. Div class of btn-wrapper at. I'm going to indent my buttons and then end the div down here. So now it is simply wrapping our two buttons. If I run this code, seemingly nothing has happened, but under the hood, we have the button wrapper, which we can target using btn-wrapper like that. And then we can do display flex. That's turned our div into a flexbox. And now we can use the justify.
podcast. Gimana ini? Sep. Refresh, mau refresh. Share mana? Oke. Gitu dah. Oke. Sorry.
By content and do center like that. There you can see both our buttons are centered. However, they are totally crammed into each other now. There's no margin in between them. So in order to fix that, we want to add a little bit of margin left and right to these buttons. So I'm going to do margin left, perhaps 4 pixels, and margin right 4 pixels as well, like that. That's looking pretty good to me. So if you didn't do this, no worries at all. And also, if you are a little bit confused about Flexbox, that is totally okay as well. We're going to work with that several times throughout this course, so you'll get more opportunities to practice this. Just feel proud that you've at least dipped your toes into Flexbox, as that is a super important tool for any front-end developer. So, great job. Let's move on. Now, there's one final thing I want you to know, and that is that you are amazing. Because you have taken your very first step into the world of CSS, and that is more than most people ever do. So take this moment to feel great about yourself. And also, let's take this moment to recap what you've learned. Starting out, you learned about the CSS syntax, that is how you select elements and also use properties and values. And then you learned the key concept about inline elements versus block elements. So block elements stacking on top of each other, like these two, and inline elements standing kind of in a horizontal line, like the buttons here. Moving on, you learned about margins, which is how you create white space outside of elements, for example, above the Google logo here. And you learned about its close cousin, the padding, which is how you create space on the inside of elements, for example, in between the text and the edges of these buttons. Also, borders is what is between padding and margin, and we use that on the input field here. We decided its thickness, its type and color, and also the radius of the corners. So we didn't want sharp edges, but rather soft, circular edges, which we achieved with this border radius property. What we also did was take a closer look at the div tag, which you saw briefly in the HTML section. This time around though, you actually created 2 divs, one to wrap the entire project and another to wrap the buttons. And we had to separate those from each other, so you had to learn about classes. That is the attribute you set like this, and you select by using the dot notation in the CSS. Also, a big thing is centering in CSS. You learned 3 different ways of doing this. And the final way you centered elements was through the use of Flexbox, a super powerful tool that all front-end developers need to be comfortable with. So you have learned a lot. Now I think you should take a little break. You have to digest these things, recharge, and then I will see you back here when you are ready in the next section. Okay, now it's time for you to go solo. And what does that mean? Well, you know how you've been getting help at every step of the way as you've been building projects? Well, it's time to remove the training wheels and have you try it on your own. So nothing but you, the code editor, and a project spec. And now you might ask yourselves, why are these solo projects important? Well, first of all, they are tailored to your exact skill level right now. So they will stress test whether you've actually learned what you're meant to learn throughout this course. And while the teacher won't walk you through the solution step by step, you will be able to ask for a student code review on Discord. Because if you've joined our Discord channel, you might have seen this code reviews channel where people add their solo project solutions and asks the community whether someone are willing to help them out and give them feedback by reviewing their code. So just like Corey here did yesterday, and luckily enough, Fama jumped on it and recorded an audio-visual code review where they gave Corey tips on how to improve the CSS and overall dryness of the code. So no wonder that Corey was super thankful for this. This is so valuable feedback to make sure that you're on the right track and that you're following best practices. Now, please remember that this is peer-to-peer and it's completely voluntarily. So you're not guaranteed a code review, though the Scrimba community is super helpful, so in many cases you will likely get it. Though if you want guaranteed code reviews by teacher assistants that we have hired, you'll have to check out our bootcamp, as there we actually vet developers as code reviewers and pay them to give you feedback on your code. Now let's move back to why solo projects are important, because the third reason is that this will build your portfolio, as we have a ton of awesome solo projects that you can add to your portfolio to help you get an edge in the job search. We have blogs, utilities, games, mobile apps, and even full-blown portfolios. So once you've done a few solo projects, your portfolio is really going to shine. Finally, before we move on, there's two things you need to know. First off, many of these solo projects are only available for pro members, so to do them you'll have to upgrade your account. This is because we want to keep a certain exclusivity for these projects, so that there's not tens of thousands of other people who have the exact same projects in their portfolio as you have in yours. If you're not in a position to upgrade your account or don't want to do that, that's also totally okay. You can just skip over this solo project and continue with the free lessons that follows after it. The core lessons of this course are free, so you'll still get a ton of value from it. But one thing you must do if you are to do a lot of solo projects is to head over to figma.com and create an account, because Figma is the underlying tool we're using to provide you with the designs, and using Figma is also a must-have skill for web developers these days. But don't worry if you think that sounds difficult, we have created a tutorial here which walks you through the basics of using Figma as a developer. So just click on this image right here and you'll be taken to that tutorial. And with that, I wish you the best of luck. Let's move on to the solo project.
Solo project nggak punya. Nanti sudah lah. CSS basic kelar, next from Discord. Menarik ya.
Hi there, this is Per from Scrimba. Just a quick pause in your learning as I wanted to tell you about our Scrimbassador program. Now, what is a Scrimbassador? It's our way of giving back to the brand ambassadors who keep on recommending Scrimba to their friends, colleagues, family members, and so forth. Because now, instead of just sharing a regular link, you can get your own unique referral link. And every sale coming from that link gives you a 30% kickback on the revenue. Now, not just from the very first payment, but from the entire first year. Now, if you convert multiple people, you also get free Scrimba Pro membership, potentially for life, and various swag rewards. Now, in addition to these materialistic perks, you also get access to an exclusive channel on Discord, where you can chat with the other Scrimbassadors and us from the team. People on Discord will see that you are an elite Scrimba member, as you'll get the Scrimbassador badge. And finally, through the Scrimbassadors channel, you'll get early access to courses once a while as well. Now, perhaps even more important than all of these perks is the effect this Scrimbassador program can have on your career. Because if you start sharing your learning journey on social media, aka learning in public, you will see that opportunities open. You build a network, put yourself out there, and show your enthusiasm. Now, taking it one step further, you can also write full articles about what you've learned. This is what I did in the beginning of my career, and it has truly been instrumental for my career progress, paying dividends up until this day, over a decade later. Now, if writing content isn't your thing, you can, for example, have the link in your Linktree or portfolio or just your social media profile page. The bottom line is that you help us spread the word about Scrimba in whatever way you are comfortable with, and we give you what we can back. Now, if this sounds interesting, click on this link right here to join, and then hopefully I'll see you in the Scrimbassadors Discord channel.
Okay, build the business card.
Welcome.